Good morning. Global consumer markets are splintering into three distinct blocks. In most of the world, the trend is toward higher quality, lower cost, and more consumer choice. This holds true in almost everything. Groceries, electricity and energy, electronics, clothing, technology of all kinds, cars, heavy equipment, machinery. In those parts of the world, energy is being supplied by low-cost producers. Same with food, and same with manufactured products. At the other extreme is North America, the United States, Canada, and probably Mexico too. Consumers in these countries pay more for everything, and this is only going to intensify and worsen as more and more regulations and trade restrictions are put on to keep out the low-cost producers. Then there's Europe, which is kind of in between. Europe is not self-sufficient in energy or food if we take Russia out, and the EU's manufacturing costs are even higher than America's. They're kind of saying for now that low-cost producers can access the European market if they set up factories there, and even if not, the tariffs are a lot lower than in the US anyway, which still gives their populations a wider range of choices generally, even after the tariffs are paid. But politicians and officials in North America have charted a course that will simply result in much higher costs, less competitiveness, fewer consumer choices. Today we'll discuss how this is playing out in the car industry, but it's happening in all industries now. Joe Biden is in a tough re-election fight, and he put on very high tariffs on a score of Chinese products. The tariff on electric cars from China were quadrupled from 25% to 100%. Chinese EVs are far ahead of the US and China, with 60% of the global market share. The White House is also looking hard at Chinese factories in Mexico, not just for cars, but for everything, because so many Chinese companies are setting up in Mexico to get around other tariffs. All of this puts Canada in an uncomfortable position. Here are some headlines about it from the Canadian side. The new tariffs put Canada in a bind. Here they want to know why they can't buy Chinese vehicles if they're cheap and good enough to sell in Europe. Why not here in Canada? And Canada is in a tough spot here. Back to Bloomberg. This analyst says that if Canada does what the US did, electric vehicles would be too expensive for 80% of Canadians. And if Canada hopes to meet their zero emission environmental targets by 2035, they either need to let Canada have access to the market or change the Canadian targets. There are many experts who are warning Canadian policymakers that Canada needs to go their own way and to ignore what Washington is doing. But Canada will probably just go along with the Americans. They won't be able to fight back against North American car makers and governments. The United States government, state governments in the United States, and provincial governments of Canada. Right now there's a 6% tariff on Chinese cars, and buyers are eligible for a rebate there, which more than zeroes out the tariff rate. If China raises those tariffs to make the car makers and Washington happy, there will be real consequences to Canadian industry. However, especially in agriculture, China would be certain to reimpose trade restrictions there. But the reality is that Canada is going to go along with the United States. Canada needs to stay in line with the US because so many of the cars made in Canada are sold in the US. If Canada does not match Joe Biden's tariffs with tariffs of their own, the United States is likely to raise tariffs on Canada-produced cars and parts. This is ironic too, because most of Canada's competition in automaking, as of now, is not coming from China, but from the low-cost areas in the United States. Southern US states are generally not unionized, so their production costs are a lot lower, and Canada cannot compete with them either. But the car manufacturers in Canada and in the US represent very powerful voting blocs, and that's what's going to matter here. They're urging lawmakers to raise tariffs and saying that if they don't, Canada will appear weak in the eyes of Americans. That's a strange conclusion Actually, if Canada doesn't go along with exactly what the American government's doing, we are going to look weak. But that's what they're saying. These guys aren't Americans who are saying this to the Canadians, that they need to do what we say. These are Canadians who are saying it about themselves. We, Canada, cannot be out of step with the US. Too much at stake if Washington looks north and decides that Canada is thinking for themselves to benefit Canadian car buyers instead of doing what Canada can to help out auto workers in Tennessee and Alabama and Joe Biden's re-election campaign. Canada has another problem here, though. Canada has put on a lot of subsidies, billions of dollars in loan guarantees and grants to build out their own electric vehicle industry, which would be at risk of being worth zero if Chinese come in to the Canadian market. Ontario is Canada's biggest economy, and their premier is demanding a 100% levy, at least a 100% levy. If they don't move fast, lots of jobs will be lost in Ontario and across Canada. There are many assembly plants in Ontario that build cars and pickups for export to the US, and he's saying the same thing here. Canada has invested billions of dollars to build electric cars, and the government has promised billions more, and so they need tariffs to protect all of these investments. So that is what is coming to Canada in electric cars. If you're in the top 20% of income earners in North America, you're going to be paying a lot more for an electric vehicle, but the good news is that you can afford it, at least. If you're an American in the bottom 80%, well, it's too bad you need a car at the same time Joe Biden is struggling in the polls in the upper Midwest. And if you're Canadian, your government has already raised your taxes and borrowed a lot of money that they need to pay back with interest over decades to build electric car plants in Ontario. And they can only earn that money back by charging you big premiums for your next car and all the cars after that. This is what we voted for, though, and whoever wins in November, whether Biden or Trump, they're going to know that they picked up a lot of votes by raising tariffs to 100%. And so look for them to be doing that again, and lots of other products too. And Washington knows that Canada will follow along and do the same, and Canada knows it too. 3 very distinct consumer markets for everything those consumers buy. The North American market, where everything costs 2, 3, 5 times more than anywhere else in the whole world. The European Union, where governments are trying to strike some kind of balance between protecting their industries on the one hand and their consumers on the other. And everywhere else where you don't have to be in the top 20% to buy nice things. This is Guangzhou, Guangdong province. Be good.
Thank you for this precious brother who has come. Thank you for making him a man of integrity and honor and wisdom. Thank you for making him a brother. Empower him. Fill him with your Holy Spirit.